Great. So I'm Chris Appy. Actually, everybody gets the name wrong. It's don't worry. No. And I have, in fact, written 3 books about the Vietnam War. If you're interested in how I came to that, we can discuss that later during the question period. But all I'll say at the outset is that I certainly didn't intend to write a 3rd book about the Vietnam War. I thought I was really finally ready to move on to something else. But then 9/11 happened, and before you knew it, we found ourselves mired in not one, but 2 wars that seemed to be endless and seemed to have these very troubling parallels to the Vietnam War. Once again, as in Vietnam, we were sending our soldiers to very far away countries and radically different cultures to where they were widely perceived as invaders or occupiers, sent then in Vietnam, as now, largely under false pretext, charged with propping up local governments in Kabul and Baghdad, as in Saigon, none of which had sufficient or broad support of their own people, charged with waging a brutal counterinsurgency warfare against an enemy that was largely indistinguishable from the population. And on top of that, given the further impossible task of somehow winning the hearts and minds of the local people. And again, in the 21st century wars, as in Vietnam, these struggles went on long beyond the point at which the American public had turned against the war. And finally, in each case, the United States was unsuccessful in achieving the stated objectives of its officials. So reading the daily news throughout 2003, 2004, 2005, on it went, I finally decided that there was yet another book I needed to write to try to make some sense of that earlier war's impact on American national identity and how that changed over time to the very present. That is to say, how does the Vietnam War continue to shape our politics, our culture, and our foreign policy? So why does the Vietnam War still matter? I just gave you a few superficial answers to that question. But given the perilous and unpredictable times we now live in, it may actually seem pretty naive to believe that studying any historical topic might do any good. After all, we have arrived at a moment when the President of the United States can apparently simply fabricate the past and the present to serve his own ends. And when he does so, his advisor, Kellyanne Conway, says he is merely relying on alternative facts. It's no wonder that George Orwell's 1984 is back on the bestseller list. You may recall that one of the more famous lines from that novel are these: "He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past." But precisely because of our new reality, in which truthfulness is more contested than ever, I believe historians have the responsibility to speak as plainly and honestly as they can about the facts of the past and how they speak to the present. And in some ways, I would say that historians and other scholars in the humanities have been a bit guilty in contributing to a world in which patently false claims can be presented as valid opinions, where alternative realities, in this almost Orwellian world in which for war can be called peace and similar conflations. So how so? What is the historian's guilt in all of this? Well, when I was going to graduate school and beyond, I began to notice that historians and other people in the humanities were, more than ever, really challenging the truth status of every sort of claim. We were told that objectivity is impossible, it's illusory, that there is no fixed or final truth, that reality can only be represented as a construction of selective evidence, that history is not immutable, but always contested and fluid, a subject that is inherently interpretive. And you know what? I actually agree with that. I am convinced that history is an interpretive discipline. It's not simply amassing a body of agreed upon facts. There are, in fact, very few truly agreed upon facts. But I think the academic world went too far in pressing that important insight, to the point where some people took the idea that, any point of view, it could be equally valid if there's no objective truth. You simply have to have, it's okay just to have an opinion. But taken to an extreme, it can contribute to a culture in which appearances and propaganda can trump reality, pun intended there. A culture in which nearly half the population can be persuaded that a president born in Hawaii was actually born in a foreign country and was thus illegitimate. Or more seriously, a culture in which very powerful people, including our new Secretary of Energy and Environmental Protection Agency, can claim that science demonstrating climate change is simply a myth, or at best only a point of view, an opinion that can be challenged. So what I'm trying to suggest, in addition to that, however, is that Donald Trump is not solely to blame. That he we didn't arrive at this moment just because of him. He is only perhaps the most successful practitioner of the politics of manufactured reality. What is perhaps new about Trump is that he does it so openly and brazenly. Let me mention just one example from 14 years ago, early in the Bush administration. It's a statement made in private, though, not in public. And it was made, we think, but we're not sure, because it was anonymously quoted by a man named Susskind, by Karl Rove, who was a very important political advisor to George W. Bush. And in that statement, he's ridiculing journalists for belonging to what he described as a reality-based community. And he goes on to say that these people, this reality-based community, they may go about a judicious study of discernible reality, but that's not the way the world really works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what you do. In other words, the president can and will create a reality of his own, real or imagined, and it will always be changing and unpredictable and beyond the control of any citizen, even beyond their comprehension. It sounds a bit like today. So how to push back against these troubling circumstances? I think there are many things for all of us to do, but I think historians can at least begin by trying to enlarge the reality-based community and really trying to speak honestly and plainly about the history that they know something about. So why does the Vietnam War still matter? Well, because the realities it exposed and the questions it raised are still very much with us. And yet in the decades since the war, many of those realities and questions have been forgotten or destroyed or sanitized. So that if we were ever to bring an end to a state of seemingly endless warfare, we need to recover an understanding of a period in our history when really a majority of Americans began to question in the most fundamental ways the nation's effort to maintain global military supremacy and the ideologies that justified that effort. That has been a constant since World War II, this idea no president could be elected in this country without claiming the absolute necessity to maintain global military superiority. And at a moment in our history when you might think presidents might have backed away from that goal, to wit, the end of the Cold War, in fact, we actually doubled down on the goal of maintaining supremacy, because now we were the lone superpower, the lone hegemon, the new Rome. And indeed, it was in that period where you began to hear military and political officials describe the goal of full spectrum dominance. Full spectrum dominance. The idea that the United States should control not only the surfaces of the planet's landmass, but also the oceans, and not just the oceans on top, but what's underneath them, and the air above the Earth, and not just the immediate air, but the outer space, and cyberspace. Essentially, every inch should be dominated by American power, and that remains a principal objective of American policy, and presumably no one could get elected president who rejected it. And underwriting that goal and justifying it, I would argue, is an ideological faith that I would call American exceptionalism, which in foreign policy terms means the broad faith that the United States is an invincible and indispensable force for good in the world, always on the side of democracy and freedom and human rights, and that were we not to exercise our authority, including military authority, on a global basis, all hell would break loose. The world would be even more dangerous and less free. This is a faith that has been with us throughout our history, really going back all the way, perhaps, to a famous lay sermon aboard the Arbella given by John Winthrop, where he said, "The eyes of the world are upon us, and we shall build a city on a hill," a phrase that Ronald Reagan liked to quote many times, that we, the United States, are a shining city on the hill. He sort of electrified the original metaphor. But this idea that we were destined by God, really, to lead the world has been there from the beginning. It gets extended in various ways through the phrase manifest destiny in the 19th century, and probably reached its heyday, I would argue, during World War II and in the 15 years after. Now, it could be argued that there were reasons to challenge the claim of American exceptionalism all the way back in our history, that the Euro-American conquest of the continent and the displacement and the death of much of the indigenous population itself raises challenges to the assumption that we, as Americans, have a uniquely value, put a higher price on life than other cultures or countries. So too, the history of slavery might well have challenged the faith in American exceptionalism. But what I argue in my book is that it really took all the way to the Vietnam War before that faith became really fundamentally challenged. And it's very complicated to sort of tease out all the various ways in which that slow transition happens, but I'm quite convinced that it did. So that by 1971, just for example, a vast majority of Americans had concluded that the war was a mistake. Even more surprising, a full majority, 58%, concluded that the war was immoral. The questions raised about the Vietnam War were central to that transformation in American thinking, but of course, all the social movements of the 60s contributed to it. This was a time in which every sort of authority or conventional thinking underwent challenge and change. And I think there's a great, that provides us a great sort of legacy to reflect on and try to recover, because in the decades since the war, I go on to argue, there's been a quite successful effort to cobble back together again a new version and a new faith in American exception. It sort of takes I think it's a more brittle and defensive and in some ways belligerent a form of nationalism, but it has been effective. Sort of Humpty Dumpty has been rebuilt after being fundamentally shattered. So my own thought is that American exceptionalism is a faith or even an ideology that we would be better off without. I don't think the historical record justifies it, first. Second, I think it alienates the entire world. Who in the world wants to be told that they are second, or third rank to the Americans? Or who could imagine telling their first grader to go into school and make sure on that first day that you tell all your classmates that you are exceptional and they aren't, or that you're indispensable? I mean, think about that phrase, the indispensable nation, first coined, I think, by Madeleine Albright. But just think about that word. What is the opposite of indispensable? Dispensable. So does that mean the rest of the world is dispensable? So it's not good for our public image, even if we believe, we're exceptional. Probably not a good thing to voice. And finally, to the extent that we're persuaded that we are, in fact, a force for good in the world and all that goes with that, I think it inclines us to be much too acquiescent and deferential to policymakers, a tiny elite of policymakers that continue to intervene in our name based on the promise that we are extending freedom and goodness and stability throughout the world in spite of evidence that contradicts those claims. So that's, in a nutshell, sort of the argument of the book. But I want to go beyond generalities tonight to tell you a few stories, because one of the reasons I think that the power elite is so successful at maintaining its power is that they do a good job not just of creating alternative facts and their own realities, but they disparage and dismiss and define as illegitimate or irrelevant the stories of ordinary people whose experiences really do expose some of the troubling realities we would prefer to forget or sanitize. So I want to talk a bit about a man named Jim Souter, an American veteran of the Vietnam War, who I met about 17 years ago. As it happens, I met him in Hanoi. We just happened to be there at the same time and were introduced by a mutual acquaintance, and he agreed to let me interview him about his experiences in a hotel room. Parenthetically, the phenomenon of Vietnam veterans returning to Vietnam is an extraordinary post-war phenomenon. I mean, thousands, who knows how many, there's no reliable account, but thousands and thousands of Vietnam veterans have gone back to Vietnam. And without exception, at least among the people I've talked to, it has been a very positive experience. Now, many have gone back as tourists, but a surprising number have gone back with a much larger intention, which is to establish true projects of reconciliation and peace and renewal. They have engaged in collaborations around art and literature and music and medicine and education and on and on. Even one example, a man named Chuck Searcy, who's been living in Vietnam for really since the early 90s, started a project called Project Renew, the purpose of which was to train Vietnamese teams to be able to go into the countryside and defuse unexploded ordnance, of which there is a massive amount. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese and Cambodians and Laotians have been killed or maimed by stepping on, or even little kids picking up unexploded cluster bombs, for example, which were these little baseball-size bomblets that were tucked inside of a larger bomb, hundreds of them, and when they exploded, if they exploded, they would send these razor-sharp flechettes in every sort of direction. Very, very gruesome kind of ordnance, but if you're a kid, you might see it just in the field and pick it up. So part of this project is to train people not to do that, and then to call upon the trained teams to come and defuse it. And they've achieved some really great success doing that. So that's, there are one of the few positive things to come out of the war is sort of the peacemaking that's come and been led by, actually, Vietnam veterans. But back to Jim Souter, who I met in Vietnam. So I asked him, of course, why are you back here? To which he said, I wanted to come back and see the place at peace. I wanted to put a face on the Vietnamese because I damn sure didn't the first time I was here. They were just gooks, slopes, or dinks. Now, Jim Souter grew up in northern Minnesota in the Iron Range, the so-called Mesabi Range. He was a working class kid from a family of miners. And while he did go briefly for 1 year to a junior college, he felt lost and ended up dropping out to follow in the footsteps of his family and to work in the mines. I knew, he said, when I quit college, I'd lose my student deferment and get drafted. I had no problem with that because I was a patriot. I believed in the flag. I believed in serving my country. And so he was drafted. And he soon discovered that he was exceptionally good at being a soldier in the Army. He trained successfully to be a flight engineer for Chinook helicopters. These are these very big helicopters, double-rotored. And as flight engineer, he said, I was in charge of a $1.5 million helicopter. Wherever it went, I went. I took care of all the maintenance, all the records. It was my ship. That was something, there was something grand about that for a 19-year-old specialist E4. That's a rank just above private, pretty low rank. But not only did he discover that he was good at his job, he also learned something else. I loved war. I can't deny it. I loved it. I hate it now, but at the time, as a kid, I loved it. I just loved flying. On some missions as flight engineer, he would man one of the extra machine guns on board. I loved being on an M60 machine gun, banging away on that thing. God, there was nothing like a combat assault when you went in with 20, 30, 40 choppers, just that energy. There were veterans who never got over that adrenaline rush. They became addicted to it. But much of his duty was really quite ordinary. He'd fly in troops in and out of zones, or he would bring in supplies to fire bases and so forth. But one of the things he did quite a lot of, which is not very well known part of the American War, is he participated in the forced relocation of Vietnamese farmers, peasants in the rural countryside. Where these helicopters or tanks would go into these communities and force the people off the land and haul them away to refugee camps, which intentionally, the intentional forced relocation. And the most conservative estimates indicate that at least 5 million South Vietnamese villagers were forcibly relocated by the American military out of a population of only 17 million. So it's an obvious question arises, why would we do that? There was a certain logic, misguided at that, behind it. The idea was that, well, we're fighting an insurgency against these guerrilla troops out in the countryside, and they're getting a lot of support from these farmers who are offering them food, hiding places, intelligence, recruits, we smart American officials have read a little bit of Mao, Chairman Mao, and he says that guerrillas are like fish swimming in the ocean of the people, that they need the ocean of people to survive. So maybe it would be a good idea to remove the ocean. That is, remove the people from the countryside, thereby sort of stranding the insurgents. So we'll haul them out of the, away from their ancestral lands into these refugee camps, where, by the way, we can keep an eye on them and control them. And then we will declare all the land that we had just depopulated a quote-unquote free fire zone, meaning we will reserve to ourselves the right to fire at will at anything that moves in that area. Random, what was called harassment and interdiction fire that would just fire sort of blindly at certain coordinates, or some more concerted airstrikes, or just ground fire, anything. What complicates that is that a lot of Vietnamese villagers weren't happy in the refugee camps, understandably, and went back to their ancestral homelands where their relatives had been buried and where they had farmed that land for generations. So they would get subjected to fire in those free fire zones. So here is a passage where Jim Souter is describing what it's like to participate in the forced relocation of a population, actually generating internal refugees. That's refugees. Those 5 million people were internal refugees. On one mission where we were depopulating a village, we packed about 60 people into my Chinook. They'd never been near this kind of machine and were really scared. But there were people forcing them in with M16, so they didn't have a choice. We got them all in and had them squatting. There were only 4 of us with 60 of them. We started lifting off, and one of the Vietnamese in the back stood up and freaked out. He was in his 30s or 40s, hard to tell. I couldn't get him to him because all the people were between me and him. We were probably 60 feet off the ground, maybe more. The crew chief just thought, fuck it, you're out of here, and pitched the man out the back end. I remember looking out the side of the chopper when he hit the ground. He just laid there. I'm sure he was killed, but we never heard anything about it. There was never any follow-up. Even at that time in the war, I felt within myself that the forced dislocation of these people was a real tragedy. I never flew refugees back in. It was always out. Quite often, they would find their own way back into these free fire zones. We didn't understand that their ancestors were buried there, that it was very important to their culture and religion to be with their ancestors. They didn't understand what the hell was going on and had no say in what was happening. I could see the terror in their faces. They were defecating and urinating and completely freaked out. It was horrible. One of my big regrets is that we didn't know anything about the Vietnamese when we went there, and we didn't know anything more when we left. If circumstances had been different, we might have learned so much from them instead of learning nothing and doing so much damage. Everything I had been raised to believe in was contrary to what I saw in Vietnam. So there's a lot more in that interview, but it essentially underlines the main point that you can get from this story, that here was a patriotic young man who believed he was doing the right thing in going to Vietnam, whose faith was completely shattered by what he experienced and what he was ordered to do in Vietnam, and the damage that it was doing to a people he thought he might otherwise have felt a kind of common humanity with. Now, just remember this again. This was because we live now in a time where of humanitarian. One of the greatest humanitarian refugee crises in world history, where there are millions of refugees seeking sanctuary in other countries, and we've now, of course, ordered at least temporary block on any of them coming in. This was then, as now, we are largely responsible for generating refugees. It's not just in Syria. Millions of people have fled Iraq, either both internally and externally. And a few million, even some of them, often many of their most skilled, have left Iraq. And so one might say, as in Vietnam, we have an exceptional responsibility to try to bring them in. And while I think we did not do a great job evacuating those Vietnamese who did want to leave after the war. The final evacuation came way too late, and there were hundreds of thousands of people that might have come then if it had been handled well. We still, at least immediately, got some 50,000 people out. Now, much less so. But there was a kind of, speaking of Orwell, there was even then a very bizarre way in which the military described the whole issue of forced relocation. For example, in some of these operations, when they were evacuating the villagers would be labeled hostile civilians or Viet Cong suspects. In other words, the implication being we're removing these people from their land because they are potential enemies, the bad guys. But when they arrived in the refugee camp, suddenly they got a new name. They were described as refugees from communism. So the implication being that they had sort of voluntarily decided to leave a part of the country where the communists controlled. Now they could be free and protected by the United States. So Jim Souter's story, like so many others, fundamentally challenged the claim that the United States was acting as a force for good in Vietnam. And there were many others that challenged the idea that we were on the side of democracy. And in fact, I would argue that we early on blocked what might have been a democratic solution to the whole war. Without going into great detail, the Geneva Accords of 1954 called for a nationwide election that would have reunified Vietnam, which was never intended to be two separate countries. And that election was never held, not because Ho Chi Minh didn't want it. He was praying for it because he was pretty confident he would win. So too was President Dwight Eisenhower, whose intelligence people were telling him that Ho Chi Minh would have won by 80%, North and South. So it was the United States and our South Vietnamese allies that blocked a democratic solution to the war that might have averted the whole thing. So it was this, Americans in the 60s were gradually becoming aware of the contradictions between official claims and the underlying realities. And that's what explains this real shattering of faith in American exceptionalism. Nothing did it more so than the revelation of the My Massacre in 1969, which had actually occurred 20 months earlier, but the Army had successfully covered it up. For those of you who don't know the details, I'll simply say an American infantry company went into a South Vietnamese village and proceeded over a 4-hour period to systematically murder roughly 500 unarmed and unresisting civilians, most of them women and children and older men. And the revelation of that really did, I think, confirm to many Americans that, maybe we don't put a higher price on life than other nations. Even many supporters of the war felt compelled to somehow justify it by saying, well, in war, atrocities are always happen and are committed by all sides. But once you've made that concession that everybody does it, you've sort of thrown out the window this idea of American exceptionalism, that we're better than the enemies. It's just saying, well, war is hell when we all behave, all sides commit war crimes. So, as I say, there was this moment in the late 60s and early 70s of fundamental challenging, but there was, in the decades after, a very powerful effort to refocus the discussion of Vietnam. And it's a complicated story that I tell in the book, but what it really boils down to is to stop paying attention to what we actually did in and to Vietnam and all the wreckage that we created, including the loss of perhaps some 3 million Vietnamese deaths and untold wounds and orphans and all other kinds of horrible things, to forget all of that and instead focus on what the bad things the Vietnam War did to us, and to describe it as a quote-unquote American tragedy that had deeply divided us and had, as Reagan successfully argued enough to win a election and re-election, that it was because of the war that our patriotism, our national pride, our power, and our international prestige had been deeply eroded, and we needed to rebuild all of those things. So it became a kind of American-centered focus. And you know, that project really, in some ways, is still with us. So I want to try to wrap it up soon to give you time to ask some questions. All I'll say by way of conclusion, so that I don't end in such a bleak, such a bleak manner, it's my sort of hopeful ending. You know, history really is unpredictable, and good things can sometimes come at moments that you might not expect. And here are two examples. In the early 1980s, for example, no one was predicting that the Soviet Union would dissolve a decade later. That was sort of unthinkable. In fact, the Cold War under the early years of Reagan was getting bigger and more dangerous by the day. No one in the early 80s would have predicted, to give another example, that Nelson Mandela would leave prison and become the president of South Africa. So it is conceivable that that Donald Trump may actually, among other things, inspire the greatest and most diverse grassroots movement in American history, the elements of which are there and developing every day. I mean, the extraordinary turnout for the Women's March and the airport protest, along with sort of earlier struggles for global climate justice and protest against mass incarceration and LGBT rights, and lots of and the anti-nuclear movement, lots of other movements may indeed find some coalescence, because they all do, I think, have something in common, which brings us back really to Souter's insight, which is that one of the things I didn't quite quote, but he really clearly believes is that one of the lessons Americans need to learn from Vietnam is the lesson that Martin Luther King offered in his extraordinary anti-war speech of 1967, which I really recommend to you. I think it's his greatest speech. It's the Riverside Church speech, April 4th, 1967. Just Google, it's easy to find. It came precisely 1 year before he was assassinated, where he says it's not just, our objective is not just to end this particular war, as bad as it is. We really need to fundamentally change American values. And unless and until we get to a moment where we replace identifications based on tribe and class and race and nation and replace it with a more a global identification of the world, we will never be able to eradicate the giant triplet evils which he defined, as racism, he didn't say capitalism, but he sort of meant it, materialism, and what was the third, imperialism, basically. So I think that was Souter's insight, but also the thing that holds all those movements together. When you think about it, they all need global solutions, whether it's the climate movement or the refugee crisis, and it all hinges on coming to a conclusion that as a country we've never quite gotten there yet, even though in our churches and communities we pay homage to it all the time, which is that all human life, we're all equal under God, right? That all human life should be equally, all lives matter, that they have equal worth. And that's something that, if it really does come to be, could really fundamentally change everything, including our foreign policy. So thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.